Ambassador Jake Rodriguez stared at his coffee cup and wondered, not for the first time, how his career had led him to this exact moment. Sitting in the fluorescent-lit conference room of Harmony Hub, the galaxy's most aggressively beige space station, surrounded by beings that looked like they'd escaped from a fever dream, listening to what could only be described as the universe's most dysfunctional parent-teacher conference. The Zephyr and Young require precisely 17.4 degrees of atmospheric moisture, no more, no less, droned High Chancellor Vextar, a 7-foot-tall reptilian whose idea of Casual Friday apparently involved adding a second monocle. Any deviation results in immediate developmental catastrophe. Jake took another sip of his coffee, which was somehow both too strong and too weak simultaneously. Only the Galactic Food Service could achieve that particular miracle of mediocrity. Furthermore, Vextar continued, his forked tongue flicking out to emphasize each word, the notion that any species other than a Zephyr could properly nurture Zephyr offspring is not merely absurd, it is biologically impossible. A chorus of agreement rippled through the assembled delegates. The crystalline collective tinkled their approval like wind chimes in a hurricane. The Netharian representative, who looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a bureaucrat, pulsed a nauseating shade of agreement. Green. Even the AI delegation, which consisted of a single floating cube that occasionally beeped, managed to convey smug superiority. Jake had come to the Galactic Childcare Convention expecting discussions about funding for interplanetary daycare centers, maybe some debates about standardized nap times across different time zones. Instead, he'd walked into what could only be described as the galaxy's most elaborate excuse for why nobody wanted to babysit each other's kids. The Metharian spawn require songs sung at precisely 412 hertz, proclaimed Ambassador Glurp, whose species had apparently evolved from what happened when you crossed a tuba with a walking carpet. Only Metharian vocal cords can achieve this frequency. Any other attempt results in the young developing antisocial tendencies and an unfortunate predilection for elevator music. Jake glanced at his notes, which consisted mostly of doodles of spaceships and a grocery list he'd forgotten to leave at home. Apparently the galaxy had a problem. A big one. Every species was absolutely 100% convinced that only they could properly raise their own young. This would be fine, except for the minor issue of interspecies relationships, cross-cultural adoption, and the occasional situation where parents died and left their kids in the care of, well, anyone who wasn't their exact species. The results, according to the 17-hour presentation he'd endured yesterday, had been universally catastrophic. Zephyrian young raised by Metharians developed an irrational fear of humidity. Crystalline offspring adopted by the Sludge Coalition turned opaque and lost their ability to refract light properly. One particularly tragic case involved a Netharian child raised by robots who grew up thinking emotions were a software glitch that needed debugging. Clearly, Vextar was saying, adjusting both monocles for maximum condescension, the solution is simple. We must establish strict species-specific orphanages, with no cross-cultural adoption permitted under any circumstances. The room buzzed with approval. Jake realized with growing horror that he was watching the galaxy's most advanced civilizations essentially agree to institutionalize their own children, rather than admit that maybe, just maybe, love and care might transcend species barriers. He thought about his own childhood. His parents had been human, sure, but his neighborhood had been a chaos of different cultures, languages, and approaches to child-rearing. Mrs. Chen next door had taught him patience through origami. Old Giuseppe down the street had shown him how to grow tomatoes and curse in 3 languages. His babysitter Rosa had been convinced that children needed to learn salsa dancing before they could walk properly. Somehow, Jake had survived this multicultural parenting disaster to become a reasonably functional adult who only occasionally broke into spontaneous salsa moves during diplomatic negotiations. What about Earth's approach? Jake heard himself say before his brain could stop his mouth from making what was probably a career-ending mistake. The room fell silent. 17 different species turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from polite confusion to active horror. The floating AI cube actually paused its beeping, which Jake was pretty sure was the robotic equivalent of a dramatic gasp. "I'm sorry," Vextar said, both monocles glinting dangerously. "Did the human just suggest that your primitive species might have something to contribute to this discussion?" Jake looked around the room, realized he was probably about to become the first human ambassador to be laughed out of a galactic council meeting, and decided that if he was going down, he might as well go down swinging. "Well," he said, settling back in his chair, "we do have this crazy idea that love might be universal." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the space station's air recycling system humming 3 levels up. Vextar's laugh sounded like someone had taught a garbage disposal how to express condescension. "Love," he repeated, as if Jake had just suggested solving galactic hunger by teaching everyone to photosynthesize. "How delightfully primitive." "Oh, this should be good," muttered Ambassador Glurp, his carpet-like fur rippling with what Jake assumed was amusement. "Please, human, enlighten us about your species' quaint, emotional approach to child-rearing." Jake felt his diplomatic training kick in, which mostly consisted of smiling politely while internally screaming, but something about Vextar's tone, combined with the collective smirk radiating from every alien in the room, made him decide that diplomacy could take a coffee break. "Right, well," Jake said, standing up and walking to the front of the room like he actually knew what he was doing. "Here's the thing. On Earth, we've got this weird habit of adopting anything that needs taking care of. Dogs, cats, birds, reptiles, fish, plants that we talk to like they're our children, and occasionally random humans who aren't even related to us." The crystalline collective chimed in harmonious confusion. The Netherian delegate pulsed a skeptical purple. "We've got families where the parents are different ethnicities, different religions, different everything," Jake continued, warming to his theme and possibly his own professional destruction. "We've got single parents raising kids who look nothing like them. We've got grandparents raising grandchildren, siblings raising siblings, neighbors raising neighbors' kids. Somehow, against all biological logic, these children grow up to be reasonably functional adults." "Anecdotal evidence," Vextar dismissed with a wave of his clawed hand. "Your species lacks the sophisticated understanding of biological compatibility that we possess." "Sophisticated understanding," Jake repeated slowly. "Right. The same sophisticated understanding that says it's better to stick kids in institutions than let someone who actually cares about them provide a home." The room erupted in indignant chatter. Jake realized he'd just insulted the collective parenting wisdom of 17 different civilizations, which was probably going to look great on his performance review. "Very well," Vextar said, his voice cutting through the noise like a bureaucratic sword. "If humans are so confident in their primitive emotional approach, perhaps you would care to demonstrate?" Jake felt a familiar sensation, the same one he'd experienced just before agreeing to eat that suspicious street food on Centauri Prime, or accepting that blind date his sister had set up with someone she'd described as unique. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of a very tall cliff and realizing someone was about to push him off. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Vextar's smile revealed far too many teeth. "A trial. We provide you with 3 younglings from different species, each with their own specific needs and requirements. If your human families can successfully raise them for a period of 6 standard months without causing permanent psychological damage, we will consider revising our position on cross-species adoption." "And if we fail?" Jake asked, though asking seemed like a formality at this point. "When you fail," Vextar corrected, "Earth will formally acknowledge the superiority of species-specific child-rearing and support our proposal for segregated orphanages across the galaxy." Jake looked around the room. Every alien face stared back at him with expressions ranging from smug anticipation to outright pity. The floating AI cube actually projected a small holographic image of what appeared to be a human tombstone, which Jake had to admit was both technologically impressive and deeply insulting. He thought about calling Earth, explaining the situation to his superiors, maybe getting some actual experts involved. Then he remembered that his superiors were the same people who had sent him to a childcare convention with instructions to smile, nod, and try not to start any intergalactic incidents. "What species are we talking about?" Jake heard himself ask, which was apparently his mouth's way of accepting the challenge before his brain could object. Vextar's smile widened. "A Zephyrin energy being in its larval stage, a Verdanian plant creature seedling, and a proto-sludgegelling from the Coalition's outer colonies." Jake nodded as if this made perfect sense, while internally his brain was screaming something that roughly translated to, "What have you done, you magnificent idiot?" The Zephyrin youngling, designation Zip, exists partially in an energy state and has a tendency to phase through solid matter when distressed, Vextar continued cheerfully. The Verdanian seedling, called Monk, is carnivorous and has already consumed 3 of its previous caretakers. The proto-sludgeling, known as Wobble, communicates entirely through color changes and has the consistency of grape jelly. "Right," Jake said, wondering if his diplomatic insurance covered death by alien toddler. "And these younglings need homes for 6 months. Standard months, Vexstar clarified. With full monitoring, of course. We wouldn't want any tragic accidents to go unrecorded. The other delegates murmured their agreement. Jake realized he was looking at beings who were essentially setting him up to fail spectacularly, probably so they could use his failure as justification for their own prejudices. Which honestly just made him more determined to prove them wrong. Fine, he said, extending his hand toward Vexstar in what he hoped looked like a confident gesture rather than the panic-induced muscle spasm it actually was. You've got yourself a deal. Vexstar stared at the offered hand for a moment, then grasped it with his clawed appendage. His grip was cold and slightly damp, like shaking hands with a particularly unfriendly iguana. Excellent, Vexstar said. I do so look forward to documenting your species' inevitable failure. Jake smiled back, hoping it looked more confident than terrified. Yeah, well, we humans have this saying. Never underestimate the power of someone who has absolutely no idea what they're doing but really good intentions. I don't believe that's actually a human saying, the AI cube beeped helpfully. It is now, Jake replied, and wondered what exactly he was going to tell the 3 human families he was about to volunteer for the most bizarre babysitting job in galactic history. 3 weeks later, Jake stood in the arrivals bay of Denver Spaceport, watching a shuttle from Harmony Hub dock with all the grace of a drunk elephant attempting ballet. He'd spent those 3 weeks making what were quite possibly the 3 most awkward phone calls in human history. The first call had gone to Bob and Linda Martinez, retired teachers from Phoenix who had somehow raised 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and approximately 43 foster kids over the years. Their response to Jake's request to temporarily adopt an energy being that could phase through walls had been, and Jake quoted directly from his notes, "Well, honey, we've dealt with teenagers. How much weirder could it get?" The second call had reached Pete Sullivan, a single father and mechanical engineer from Portland, whose 8-year-old daughter Emma had been asking for a sibling for years. Pete's reaction to the news that said sibling would be a carnivorous plant had been surprisingly positive, mostly because he figured anything that could eat weeds in his garden was probably a net benefit. The third call had gone to Ethel Morrison, a 78-year-old grandmother from Des Moines, whose response to the prospect of caring for a gelatinous blob creature had been, "Oh good, something that won't judge me for watching my stories all day." Now as the shuttle's doors hissed open, Jake wondered if he should have been more specific about exactly what he was asking these people to do. Maybe mention the part about galactic surveillance, or the fact that failure could result in him being banned from 17 different star systems. The first being to emerge from the shuttle was Vexstar, both monocles gleaming with what Jake was beginning to recognize as his signature expression of barely contained smugness. Behind him floated a delegation of alien observers, each equipped with enough recording equipment to film a documentary series. "Ambassador Rodriguez," Vexstar said, his forked tongue flicking out in what Jake hoped was a greeting rather than a threat assessment. "I trust your primitive child care providers are prepared for their inevitable failure?" "They're prepared for something," Jake replied, which was technically true. He'd sent each family a care package containing basic information, emergency contact numbers, and enough chocolate to survive what he suspected was going to be a very long 6 months. The younglings came next, each accompanied by their respective species' child development experts, who looked like they were attending a funeral rather than a placement ceremony. Zip was the first to emerge, and Jake's brain immediately filed the experience under things I wasn't trained for in diplomatic school. The Zephyrian youngling looked like what would happen if someone crossed a toddler with a lightning bolt. Roughly humanoid in shape, Zip flickered between solid and translucent, occasionally sparking with small bursts of energy that made Jake's hair stand on end. Zip requires a minimum of 4 hours of meditation per day to maintain corporeal stability, droned Dr. Krexnell, the Zephyrian expert, whose idea of appropriate childcare attire apparently involved robes that looked like they'd been designed by someone who had only heard electricity described secondhand. Any disruption to this schedule will result in uncontrolled phasing episodes and potential electrical damage to surrounding infrastructure. Jake nodded like this made perfect sense while internally updating his mental list of things he should probably have mentioned to the Martinez family. Munk followed, carried in what appeared to be a reinforced terrarium by 2 very nervous-looking Verdanian handlers, wearing what Jake could only describe as medieval armor. The plant creature looked like a cross between a Venus flytrap and a particularly aggressive houseplant, with tiny thorns, bright green leaves, and what appeared to be several rows of very sharp teeth. "The seedling must be fed live protein every 6 hours, explained Dr. Thornwick, whose species had apparently evolved from what happened when trees developed anxiety disorders. Previous caretakers who failed to maintain this schedule have experienced unfortunate incidents involving loss of fingers, toes, and in one case, an entire arm. Jake glanced at Pete Sullivan, who had just arrived and was staring at Munch with the expression of someone trying to calculate exactly how much his homeowner's insurance covered. Finally came Wobble, transported in what looked like a very large fishbowl filled with some kind of stabilizing gel. The proto-sludge gilling was exactly what its name suggested, a roughly child-sized blob of translucent purple jelly that shifted and rippled with every movement. As Jake watched, Wobble's color changed to a bright orange, then flickered through several shades of blue before settling on a nervous-looking yellow. Color communication is extremely complex, stated Dr. Gloop, who appeared to be made of the same material as his patient but in a more dignified shade of gray. Yellow indicates anxiety, red means hunger, blue suggests contemplation, and purple represents contentment. There are approximately 4,732 documented color combinations, each with specific meanings. Ethel Morrison, who had arrived wearing a tracksuit and carrying a purse large enough to hide a small spacecraft, looked at Wobble and immediately brightened. "Oh, aren't you just the sweetest little thing? Don't you worry, honey. Grandma Ethel's going to take real good care of you." Wobble immediately shifted to a soft pink color that Jake was pretty sure wasn't on Dr. Gloop's official chart. The alien experts spent the next hour delivering increasingly dire warnings about the specific needs, requirements, and potential catastrophic failures associated with each youngling. Jake translated this into what he hoped was reassuring guidance for the human families, though he suspected his version sounded more like, "Try not to let them die, and call me if anything catches fire." As the three families prepared to leave with their new charges, Vextar approached Jake with the satisfied expression of someone who had just set a very elaborate trap. "I have taken the liberty of installing monitoring equipment in each residence," he announced. "For the youngling's safety, of course." "Of course," Jake agreed, wondering if the monitoring equipment included a betting pool on which family would crack first. "The Zephian child will last perhaps a week before the electrical disruptions become unbearable," Vextar continued conversationally. "The plant creature will likely consume its caregiver within the first month. As for the proto-sludgeling, well, the complete inability to communicate will drive even the most patient species to distraction within days." Jake watched as Linda Martinez gently helped Zip into their hovercar, speaking to the energy being in the same calm voice she'd probably used with thousands of nervous children over the years. Pete Sullivan was having an animated conversation with Munch about soil pH levels, while Ethel Morrison had somehow convinced Wobble to shift into a cheerful lavender color just by humming what sounded like an old jazz standard. "You know what, Vextar," Jake said, feeling more confident than he had since this whole mess started. "I think you might be underestimating humans." "Impossible," Vextar replied. "We have conducted extensive psychological profiles. Your species lacks the sophistication necessary for proper child-rearing." Jake grinned. "Yeah, well, we also supposedly lack the sophistication necessary for spaceflight, faster-than-light travel, and decent coffee. Turns out sophistication is overrated when you've got people who are too stubborn to quit and too kind to give up." As the three families drove away with their new charges, Jake realized he'd just committed himself to either the greatest diplomatic triumph in human history or the most spectacular failure ever recorded by 17 different species. Either way, it was going to be interesting. 2 weeks into the experiment, Jake's phone had become a source of existential dread. Every ring could be the call informing him that he'd just caused the first interspecies diplomatic incident involving a carnivorous houseplant. The first crisis came from the Martinez household at precisely 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Jake answered his phone to Linda's voice, remarkably calm for someone who was presumably calling about an energy being having a meltdown. "Jake, honey, we've got a small situation with Zip," Linda said, and Jake could hear what sounded like electrical crackling in the background. "The poor little thing phased right through the guest bedroom floor and got stuck in the foundation. Bob's down there now with a flashlight and a pack of cookies, trying to coax them out." Jake sat up in bed, already calculating how he was going to explain to Vextar that they'd lost the Zephyrin child in concrete. "Is Zip hurt? Are you and Bob okay?" "Oh, we're fine," Linda assured him. "Zip just got scared during a thunderstorm. You know how kids are with loud noises. The electrical activity outside got them all worked up and they started phasing uncontrollably. Bob thinks they went through the floor because they were trying to get as far away from the storm as possible." Jake heard Bob's voice in the background, muffled but enthusiastic. "Tell Jake that Zip loves chocolate chip cookies. Who knew energy beings had taste buds?" The monitoring equipment is going crazy, Linda continued conversationally. That nice Dr. Crexenel fellow called about an hour ago, very upset about unprecedented energy fluctuations and containment protocol failures. I told him we had everything under control. And do you? Jake asked, because he had to ask. Well, Bob's teaching Zip how to play 20 questions to keep them calm while we figure out how to get them back up here. Turns out energy beings are very good at the question part, not so much with the answering. But they're giggling now, which I figure is probably a good sign. Jake hung up, feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. The giggling was probably good. Probably. The call from Pete Sullivan came 3 days later, and Jake could hear power tools in the background, which seemed like either a very good sign or a very bad one. Hey Jake, quick question, Pete said, his voice cheerfully unconcerned. Is it normal for carnivorous plants to start building things? Jake paused in the middle of brushing his teeth. I'm sorry, what? Munk has been watching me work on Emma's treehouse, and now they've started arranging sticks and leaves into what looks like architectural structures. Emma thinks they're trying to build their own house. She's been helping by bringing them materials from the yard. Pete, Jake said carefully, please tell me you're not letting your 8-year-old daughter help feed a carnivorous alien. Oh no, Munch won't eat anything Emma gives them. Turns out they're very particular about their protein sources. They'll only accept food from me, and only after I've explained what it is and where it came from. Very polite about it, actually. Yesterday I offered them a cricket, and they somehow managed to shake their head no. Apparently they prefer worms. Jake could hear Emma's voice in the background, excitedly explaining something about Munch's new leaf castle. The thing is, Pete continued, Dr. Thornwick keeps calling and insisting that Mung should be in a specialized terrarium with controlled temperature and humidity. But Mung seems to prefer the backyard. They've actually been helping with the garden, eating all the bugs that were destroying my tomatoes. Emma's convinced they understand English now, because they always turn toward whoever's talking. Do they? Jake asked. Well, yesterday Emma asked them to help her find her soccer ball, and Munch immediately pointed one of their vines toward the shed where she'd left it. So either they understand English, or they're really good at reading context clues. Jake made a note to himself to research whether carnivorous plants could develop cognitive abilities through exposure to human conversation, then realized this was probably not something covered in standard diplomatic training. The call from Ethel Morrison came during Jake's lunch break, and he answered to the sound of what appeared to be a game show playing at full volume. Jake, sweetie, I hope you don't mind, but I entered me and Wobble in the community center's bingo tournament, Ethel announced without preamble. Jake set down his sandwich. You what now? Well, the poor little thing seemed bored just sitting around the house all day, and Dr. Gloop's instructions said they needed social stimulation and cognitive challenges. Bingo's got both, plus prizes. Ethel, how exactly does a gelatinous blob play bingo? Oh, Wobble's got the most amazing color coordination system worked out. When they hear a number they want, they turn bright green and jiggle toward the corresponding square on their card. I just dab the marker where they indicate. We've won 3 games so far, and Martha Hendricks is convinced I'm cheating somehow. Jake could hear excited chatter in the background, along with what sounded like applause. The thing is, Ethel continued, that Dr. Gloopfellow keeps calling and asking about Wobble's emotional development indicators and social integration metrics. I told him Wobble's doing just fine, making friends and learning to play games. He didn't seem to think that was a proper answer. How is Wobble doing, really? Jake asked. Oh, wonderful. They've learned to change colors to match the TV programs we're watching. Turns bright red during action scenes, soft blue during the sad parts, and this lovely golden color during the funny bits. Yesterday we watched that old movie with the dancing, and Wobble spent the whole time shimmering through rainbow colors. I think they liked the music. Jake was beginning to suspect that the alien experts' definitions of proper child development might be slightly different from the human approach. The crisis call he'd been dreading came at the end of the 3rd week, but not from any of the families. Instead, it was Vexstar, and he sounded distinctly less smug than usual. Ambassador Rodriguez, Vexstar said, his voice tight with what Jake was learning to recognize as barely controlled panic. We need to discuss the monitoring reports. Is there a problem? Jake asked, though he was pretty sure he knew what was coming. The Zephyrian child has achieved a level of energy control that shouldn't be possible for another decade of development. The plant creature is displaying cognitive abilities that our scientists insist don't exist in their species. And the proto-slug Hegelling has developed a color vocabulary that exceeds our current understanding of their communication capability. Jake grinned. So they're doing well? They're doing impossibly well, Vexstar snapped. According to our projections, all three younglings should have experienced severe developmental regression by now. Instead, they appear to be thriving in ways that contradict every established principle of xenobiology. Maybe your established principles need updating, Jake suggested. There was a long pause. Ambassador Rodriguez, are you certain your people aren't using some form of advanced psychological manipulation? Jake thought about Linda Martinez coaxing an energy being out of a foundation with cookies and patience. About Pete Sullivan having earnest conversations with a carnivorous plant about soil composition. About Ethel Morrison teaching a blob creature to play bingo and watching old musicals together. Yeah, Vexstar, Jake said. We're using advanced psychological manipulation. We call it caring about someone. The silence that followed was so long that Jake wondered if the connection had been cut. Finally, Vexstar spoke, his voice smaller than Jake had ever heard it. This should not be possible. Welcome to humanity, Jake replied. We specialize in things that shouldn't be possible. 6 months later, Jake stood in the same arrivals bay at Denver Spaceport, but this time he wasn't alone. The Martinez family had arrived early, with Zip flickering excitedly beside them in a new pattern Jake had never seen before, steady pulses of warm golden light that somehow conveyed pure happiness. The energy being was wearing what appeared to be a tiny Denver Broncos jersey that Linda had somehow managed to make from a material that could phase shift along with its wearer. Pete and Emma Sullivan arrived next, with Monk perched contentedly in a custom-built mobile planter that Pete had designed and Emma had decorated with stickers that read, "World's Best Plant Sibling." The carnivorous plant had grown considerably, now sporting an impressive array of leaves and what Jake could swear looked like a smile. Emma was chattering excitedly about Monk's latest architectural achievement, elaborate trellis system that spelled out "Welcome Home" in living vine letters. Ethel Morrison wheeled in last, pushing a custom mobility cart that housed Wobble in a comfortable transparent chamber. The proto-sludgeling had developed what could only be described as a sophisticated color vocabulary, currently displaying a complex pattern of deep blues and warm purples that Jake's crash course in Wobble communication had taught him meant excited but nervous. Ethel was wearing a t-shirt that read "Bingo Champion," with a picture of a colorful blob giving a thumbs up. The alien delegation arrived with considerably less fanfare. Vexstar emerged from their shuttle looking like someone who had spent 6 months having his worldview systematically dismantled and rebuilt. Dr. Krexnell floated behind him, his usually pristine robes now rumpled and stained with what appeared to be coffee. Dr. Thornwick looked like a tree that had been struck by lightning and was still processing the experience. Dr. Gloop had shifted to a color that Jake was pretty sure meant existential crisis. But it was the other passengers who caught Jake's attention. 3 adult aliens, clearly the biological parents of the younglings, emerged, with expressions ranging from anxious anticipation to barely contained panic. The Zephyrian parent, a towering being of crackling energy named Fluxara, approached the Martinez family with visible trepidation. "I have come to retrieve my offspring," they announced, their voice carrying the electrical undertones characteristic of their species. "I trust the damage has been minimal." Linda Martinez stepped forward with the kind of smile that had probably diffused thousands of parent-teacher conferences. "Oh, you must be Zip's parent. We've heard so much about you. Zip, honey, come say hello to your mom." Zip immediately brightened to an intensity that made everyone nearby squint, then did something that made Dr. Krexnell drop his recording equipment. The young energy being wrapped their partially solid arms around both Linda and their biological parent simultaneously, creating a 3-way hug that sparkled with controlled electrical discharge. "Mama Linda, Mama Flux," Zip said clearly, their voice carrying the same electrical harmonics as their parent, but with an undertone of pure joy that Jake had never heard from a Zephyrian before. "Look what I learned." Zip proceeded to demonstrate their new abilities. They could now phase selectively, choosing which parts of their body remained solid. They could control their electrical output with precision, creating small light shows for entertainment rather than accidental property damage. Most remarkably, they could maintain complete corporeal stability while experiencing strong emotions, something that typically took Zephyrian younglings decades to master. "This is impossible," Fluxara whispered, their energy field fluctuating with shock. "How did you teach them such control?" Bob Martinez chuckled. "Well, it started with that night they got stuck in the Foundation. We figured they were scared, so we sat with them until they felt safe. After that, we just made sure they knew they were loved no matter what form they took. Turns out, when kids feel secure, they develop confidence in their abilities pretty quickly." Fluxara stared at the elderly human couple. "You remained with them during an uncontrolled phasing episode. The electrical discharge could have killed you. Honey, Linda said gently. We've raised 4 children and 43 foster kids. We've survived chickenpox, teenage driving lessons, and a boy who thought he could fly off the garage roof with homemade wings. A little electrical activity wasn't going to scare us off. Meanwhile, the Verdanian parent, a massive tree-like being called Rootshanks, was having their own crisis. Monk had grown into something that looked less like a traditional carnivorous plant and more like a botanical engineer, their vines forming complex supportive structures, while their root system had developed an intricate network that seemed designed for both nutrient sharing and communication. My seedling appears to have developed cognitive architecture, Rootshanks observed, their bark-like voice filled with wonder. This level of structural planning should not emerge for several growing seasons. Emma Sullivan beamed with pride. Munch is the smartest. They helped me design a whole garden system that catches rainwater and shares nutrients between all the plants. And they learned to write their name in vine letters. Show them, Monk. Munch immediately began weaving their vines into letters, spelling out Munch in elegant script before adding Loves, Emma, and Pete in smaller letters underneath. Pete Sullivan scratched his head. We just treated them like part of the family, included them in projects, asked their opinion on things, made sure they felt useful. Turns out Munch has a real talent for engineering. We've been working together on a greenhouse design that could revolutionize urban farming. You consulted a seedling on engineering projects? Rootshanks asked incredulously. Well, they seemed interested and they had some pretty creative ideas about structural support systems. Kids notice things adults miss sometimes. Munch pointed out that our drainage system was inefficient by literally growing a better design. Dr. Gloop was having the most visible breakdown of all the experts. The proto-sludge-gelling parent, a dignified being called Primuse, was staring at Wobble in complete bewilderment. The color patterns are unprecedented, Primuse murmured, their own coloration shifting through confused purples and astonished greens. This level of communication sophistication typically requires decades of cultural immersion. Ethel Morrison patted Primuse gently on what appeared to be their shoulder. Oh, Wobble's always been a smart cookie. We just spent a lot of time together, that's all. Watching stories, playing games, talking about everything and nothing. Wobble learned to express themselves because they had something to say, and someone who wanted to listen. Wobble had been cycling through colors throughout the reunion, but now they settled into a pattern Jake had never seen before, deep, rich hues that seemed to convey complex emotions, shifting between what looked like love, gratitude, contentment, and something that might have been hope. Grandma Ethel, Wobble said, their voice a melodious hum that somehow conveyed perfect clarity. Thank you for teaching me that feelings have colors, and colors have meanings, and meanings matter when someone cares enough to understand them. The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Gloop making a sound that was either a sob or the proto-sledgeling equivalent of a complete systemic shutdown. Vexstar approached Jake with the expression of someone who had just watched their entire understanding of the universe get turned inside out and shaken vigorously. Ambassador Rodriguez, he said quietly, I believe we may have made an error in our assessment of human child-rearing capabilities. Jake looked around at the 3 families, each saying tearful goodbyes to younglings who had clearly become beloved family members, while alien parents stood in stunned amazement at their offspring's unprecedented development. You know what the funny thing is, Vexira? Jake said. This isn't even unusual for us. This is just what humans do. We take in strays, love them unconditionally, and somehow they flourish. We've been doing it for thousands of years with our own species, and it never occurred to us that it wouldn't work with others. Zip flickered over to Jake, their energy pattern warm and affectionate. Uncle Jake, will we see our human families again? Jake looked at Fluxara, who was still staring at their transformed offspring in wonder. I think that's up to your parents, kiddo. Fluxara's energy field shimmered with what Jake was learning to recognize as deep emotion. If your human parents would welcome it, I believe regular visits could be beneficial for your continued development. Similar conversations were happening with the other families. Rootshanks was asking Pete about a potential cultural exchange program. Primuse was inquiring about Ethel's availability for extended educational consultations. As the mixed group prepared to leave the spaceport, Jake realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just successful cross-species adoption, but the beginning of genuine interspecies families. You know, Vexstar said, approaching Jake one final time, perhaps our definition of sophisticated child-rearing was somewhat limited. Jake grinned. Yeah, well, turns out love doesn't require a PhD in xenobiology. Sometimes all you need is patience, cookies, and a willingness to learn from someone half your size who sees the world completely differently than you do. Vextar nodded slowly. Indeed, most educational. 1 year later, Jake found himself back in the same aggressively beige conference room on Harmony Hub, but the atmosphere was considerably different. For one thing, someone had apparently decided that the room needed more color, because there were now holographic displays showing what appeared to be family photos from across the galaxy. Human families with alien children, alien families with human children, and various combinations that Jake was pretty sure would have given the previous year's delegates collective heart attacks. The seating arrangement had also changed dramatically. Instead of species-segregated sections, the delegates were mixed together in a way that suggested either unprecedented diplomatic progress or a complete breakdown of organizational protocols. Jake spotted Ambassador Glurp deep in conversation with a human social worker from Mumbai, while several Crystalline Collective members were apparently comparing notes with a group of kindergarten teachers from Oslo. Vextar approached the podium with what Jake had learned to recognize as his grudging admission of being completely wrong expression. He'd traded his formal diplomatic robes for something that looked suspiciously like a casual sweater, and Jake noticed he was only wearing one monocle now. Esteemed colleagues, Vextar began, his voice carrying none of its previous condescension. I stand before you today to formally present the findings of the Human Foster Protocol trial and to announce what may be the most significant shift in galactic child care policy in recorded history. Jake settled back in his chair, trying to hide his grin. The past year had been a whirlwind of follow-up visits, expanded trials, and increasingly panicked calls from alien child development experts who couldn't explain why human-raised younglings were consistently outperforming their traditionally raised peers in every measurable category. The initial trial involved 3 test subjects, Vextar continued, pulling up holographic displays that showed before and after developmental assessments. Zip, the Zephian energy being, achieved full corporeal control 18 months ahead of projected timelines while developing unprecedented emotional regulation capabilities. Munch, the Verdanian seedling, demonstrated cognitive and creative abilities that our botanists insist are impossible for their species. A murmur went through the assembled delegates. Jake noticed that none of them seemed particularly surprised by these results anymore. The past year had seen similar success stories reported from across the galaxy as the Human Foster Protocol had been quietly expanded. More significantly, Vextar continued, his voice growing stronger, each youngling demonstrated what human child development experts term secure attachment patterns with their foster families, while maintaining strong bonds with their biological parents. This dual family structure has produced psychological resilience metrics that exceed anything in our databases. Dr. Krexanal stood up in the audience, his robes now featuring what appeared to be hand-painted pictures of lightning bolts. If I may add, he said, his electrical voice carrying a warmth Jake had never heard before, my own research into Zephyrian development has been fundamentally altered by observing human parenting methods. We have begun implementing what we call patience protocols and unconditional acceptance frameworks in our traditional child-rearing practices. The results have been remarkable. Jake watched as other experts stood to share similar findings. Dr. Thornwick reported that Verdanian seedlings raised with human emotional support techniques showed unprecedented creativity and problem-solving abilities. Dr. Gloop, whose color patterns had shifted to what Jake now knew indicated scientific enthusiasm, presented data showing that proto-sludgelings exposed to human storytelling traditions developed communication skills centuries ahead of normal timelines. The evidence is undeniable, Vextar announced. Human child-rearing practices produce superior developmental outcomes across all tested species. We have no choice but to acknowledge that our previous assumptions about species-specific care requirements were incorrect. Ambassador Glurp raised a furry appendage. What exactly are these human practices that produce such results? Jake stood up, realizing that the entire galactic community was about to ask him to explain something that humans had never really thought needed explaining. Well, he began, it's not really complicated. We listen to kids, we pay attention to what they need, not what we think they should need. We include them in family activities, even when they're messy or inconvenient. We celebrate their achievements, even the small ones. We comfort them when they're scared, even when their fears seem irrational. And most importantly, we love them unconditionally, regardless of whether they meet our expectations. The room fell silent. Jake realized he'd just described basic parenting to a group of beings who had somehow turned child-rearing into rocket science. "You mean," said a crystalline delegate, their chiming voice uncertain, "you simply care for them as individuals rather than as representatives of their species?" "Pretty much," Jake confirmed. "We've found that when you treat kids like unique people instead of biological specimens, they tend to flourish." Vextar cleared his throat. "Based on these findings, the Galactic Childcare Council is prepared to vote on Resolution 2847B, which would establish the Human Foster Protocol as the recommended standard for all interspecies adoption and care situations." The vote was unanimous, which Jake figured was probably the first time in galactic history that 17 different species had agreed on anything, let alone something as fundamental as how to raise children. After the formal session ended, Jake found himself surrounded by delegates asking for advice, consultation services, and in one memorable case, babysitting recommendations. He was in the middle of explaining to a very serious Netharian official that yes, humans really did sing lullabies to children who weren't even their own species, when a familiar flicker of golden light caught his attention. "Uncle Jake!" Zip materialized beside him, their energy pattern radiating pure joy. They were followed closely by Monk, who had somehow figured out how to navigate in a mobile planter that Pete had designed for space travel, and Wobble, whose color patterns were shifting through what Jake now recognized as excited chatter. "Hey, kids," Jake said, crouching down to their level. "How are you doing?" "We came to see you get your award," Zip announced, sparkling with pride. "Mama Linda says you're going to be famous throughout the galaxy as the person who taught everyone how to love properly." Munk rustled their leaves in agreement while simultaneously using their vines to spell out, "Congratulations, Uncle Jake," in mid-air. Wobble shifted to a pattern of warm golds and deep blues that somehow conveyed both affection and gratitude. Jake looked around the room at the mixed groups of humans and aliens, all engaged in animated discussions about parenting techniques, child development, and the revolutionary concept of treating youngsters with kindness and respect. "You know what, kids," he said. "I think the real award is watching everyone realize what humans have known all along, that love doesn't require a manual. Caring doesn't need a protocol, and family isn't limited by biology." Vextar approached, his expression softer than Jake had ever seen it. "Ambassador Rodriguez, on behalf of the Galactic Child Care Council, I would like to formally apologize for our previous skepticism, and extend an invitation for Earth to establish the first Interspecies Family Services Department." Jake grinned. "Does that come with hazard pay? Because I have a feeling human families are going to start adopting every stray youngling in the galaxy." "Given human success rates," Vextar replied seriously, "I believe that would be an optimal outcome." As Jake watched Zip phase a nervous crystalline youngling, while Munch helped a shy Verdanian seedling spell their name in vine letters, and Wobble taught a group of proto-sludgelings how to create rainbow patterns, he realized something profound had happened. Humanity hadn't just proven they could raise alien children. They'd accidentally become the galaxy's go-to species for teaching everyone else how to love unconditionally. Which, when Jake thought about it, was probably the most human thing ever. They'd started with a simple challenge about babysitting and somehow ended up revolutionizing galactic society through the radical concept of actually caring about kids. "Hey, Vextar," Jake called out as the former skeptic prepared to leave. "Just one question. Are you ready for what happens when human families start teaching alien kids about things like sleepovers, birthday parties, and family game nights?" Vextar paused, both monocles glinting with what Jake now recognized as barely contained panic. "Perhaps we should establish some additional protocols for those situations." Jake laughed. "Too late. Emma Sullivan already taught Munch how to play charades. And apparently plant mime is hilarious. This is just the beginning." As the conference room filled with the sounds of interspecies children laughing and playing together while their various parents shared parenting tips across cultural barriers, Jake realized that humanity had just done what they did best. They'd made the impossible look easy, the complicated seem simple, and turned the entire galaxy into one big, weird, wonderful family. And somewhere in the background, he could swear he heard the faint sound of Ethel Morrison teaching a group of young aliens how to play bingo, because apparently some human traditions were truly universal.